morning, Mr. Commissioner. It's Brenda Gertner for the First Nations Coalition, and with me, Leah Pence. Gentlemen, I'm going to begin by talking about some broader questions around information needs, and then turn to food, social, and ceremonial information needs, and then some options for information collection, and then finally with some questions around potential recommendations. I'm going to first start, Mr. Whitehouse, if I heard you correctly yesterday, it's my understanding that DFO's management objectives drive the information needs that you use to determine priorities for stock assessment. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
And would you agree with me that in the recent years, DFO's management objectives have been evolving? So in the past, those management objectives were primarily to provide for information to feed the international treaty obligations, and in particular establishing commercial TAC and focusing on the strong runs. But now those objectives are broadening to include such things as we've talked about the wild salmon policy. So those management objectives are actually changing and have been changing over the last while. Would you agree with me on that?
There is change, yes, in management objectives.
And would you also agree that in addition to the wild salmon policy, the management objectives that you're needing to balance include licensed retirements and programs like PIC-FEE, in which DFO is beginning to pursue commercial fisheries in river? You're aware of the PIC-FEE program and the goal of pursuing commercial in-river fisheries?
Yes, I am.
Would you also agree with me that DFO has a policy on selective fishing and that that's an increasing management objective?
Yes.
And would you also agree with me that it's clear that DFO has obligations around First Nations FSC requirements, and that's a growing management objective, including providing priority for FSC fisheries?
FSC are priority issues, yes.
And you'll agree with me that meeting those FSC priorities, particularly in low abundance years, can be challenging?
Correct.
How have these emerging management objectives and these changes changed your approach to the type of information that you would like to be gathering or you feel you should be gathering for stock assessment purposes?
I think the construct in terms of information requirements have been responsive to the challenges faced in identifying the gaps associated with a number of issues, late run mortality and river mortality, et cetera, that have represented significant change to understanding dynamics of stocks as the system changes away from some of the fundamental assumptions. So by that I mean we've added pieces on to address gaps in information to try and provide further certainty with respect to reconstruction of abundance.
My observation of the evidence over the last days is you're suffering from budget cuts. So what's been added?
When we think in total, with respect to the in-season run management, we have verification components that have been added into the in-season run strength estimation. So the Quaylark system has been a piece that has assisted in validating the abundance of fish returning to the river at Mission. There has been the implementation of radio and acoustic tagging programs in both marine and freshwater areas. Tags applied to specific target groups, evolving through time as we understand the dynamics associated with run timing and mortality in river, to improve understanding of the likelihood of meeting escapement objectives based on targets set for Mission. There's been also additional work associated with the add-on of the Fraser River Environmental Watch Program, which is involved in-season management to provide estimates of potential loss rates due to mortality or environmental conditions, mortality related to environmental conditions within the river. Again, with the purpose of attempting to support the meeting of escapement objectives in terms of fish arriving on spawning grounds.
Are any of those efforts actually affecting in-season management decisions?
Yes, indeed.
Could you give me an example of that?
The Environmental Watch Program develops a factor that varies for run timing groups through the year called the management adjustment. It is a procedure whereby survival is monitored, or not monitored, but modeled based on environmental conditions to provide a leading estimate of the potential loss rates to be expected based on environmental conditions, so that additional fish can be escaped into the system to ensure that if there are loss rates, that spawning objectives will be achieved. So that would be one example.
Okay, Mr. Commissioner has heard a bit about management objectives, and we'll hear more about those, our management adjustments. So, Dr. Riddell, is there anything you'd like to add to this discussion about how information could be collected to better address the various management objectives that DFO has on their plate?
Well, I think the one thing that we haven't touched on is that for the last few years we have been working with, and it started again within DFO and then subsequently, and Mr. Alcass is involved and a number of other players, working with Simon Fraser University to develop what we call an in-river management model. And the intention of this model is specifically to try and look at delivery of spawning escapement objectives or First Nation objectives in some areas of the basin, and using all the information we're acquiring on the environmental conditions and the mortality of the fish moving upriver with the radio tagging. How quickly do they move? Are there areas in the river that they hold? And basically what we're trying to do is build a risk management model that would reconstruct the fish entering the Fraser River and how well do we think they're going to survive to get up the river. This is still very much developmental, but it's a step beyond many of the comments that Timber made about things that have been added. He didn't touch on some of the external research on late-run Fraser sockeye mortality funded through the Pacific Salmon Commission and through the Pacific Salmon Foundation. So that's probably the most outstanding additional piece that I would think of coming to mind.
Sorry, who's developing that? I didn't hear you, Doctor. I'm sorry.
The model is being developed at Simon Fraser University through sort of small, if you want, coordinating committee involving people like Scott Hinch, Carl English, myself, Mike Staley. Those are probably the major players.
And why isn't that being done by DFO? Is that primarily a budgeting issue?
No, I wouldn't say that was the primary reason at the time. The primary reason was that the people that we spoke with, we felt had the capacity to build this quickly at the time. That doesn't sound like a very good decision at this point because it hasn't been done as quickly as we wanted. But we did need to go to people with strong modeling capability. We have people like that in the department, but they were already committed to particular activities.
And so that work was the result of meetings that were held a couple of years ago, is that correct?
There was one workshop on this particular one, but it was not about the actual development of the model. They wanted to add additional elements to the modeling, particularly social economic considerations. The outcome of the workshop was one that, as we've probably seen very clearly now, adding additional things to the model and adding complexity to the model was just, it was too soon because we simply didn't have the physical model built to really add anything onto.
Perhaps I'll just stay with this topic, in particular increasing the understanding of what's happening in river and the different pressures that are associated with that. Given the recent years of increasing in-river or en route mortality and increasing challenges with water temperature and water flow, what methods are being considered to be used to inform stock assessment for returning sockeye north or upriver of Quaylark? And in answering that question, I'd like you to particularly speak on the challenges associated with runs of low abundance if you're relying on radio tagging in those circumstances.
I think the key pieces that we're talking about relate back to two components that I mentioned earlier. The Environmental Watch program and the development of models that link the conditions within the watershed to specific migratory success patterns. So this is an important piece, and it applies throughout the entire Fraser watershed, provides estimates for stock groups based on their entry timing and the conditions prevalent within the river during the period which they will be resident and migrating in the river. That's one piece. The second piece I think that is important to point out is the telemetry work, and it needs a little bit of explanation because there is levels of resolution that are quite important in the way the sampling design is structured with respect to the tagging program. What this program involves in terms of a set of monitoring networks is the placement of receivers at very important intervals along the migratory route in the main stem of both the Fraser and Thompson rivers. And as tagged fish move through the system, we're able to estimate areas in which we see losses of sockeye due to the environmental conditions. It may be a cumulative impact of associated encounters with nets and environmental conditions, but the key is that we're able to narrow down our understanding of where loss rates are. We also get information based on the relative vulnerability of particular stocks based on the DNA that is collected from those fish at the time of tagging. So what happens with this program is we release a batch of fish with radio tags, and we distribute them through their arrival timing, and we've done that in both marine areas and in freshwater. Believe that marine area tag application, for example, Johnson Straits or Juan de Fuca, is preferable because then we get a signal of fish arriving in the river and their survivorship curves as they pass frequent stations. And these stations, there can be up to 20 of them in a given year, so that we can break survival rates throughout the main stem. This information is important as it identifies areas where we may expect loss of fish based on a pattern of environmental conditions developing in a given year. And it allows us to then apply and begin to develop a model that has predictive capacity for multiple years based on patterns associated with flow and water temperature. So the integration of those parts are very important in understanding the dynamic of fish migration into the watershed.
Dr. Riddell?
I think Timber has touched on most of the points. I mean, I think to put this together, you need to have the components that we've talked about in previous meetings here. Quail arc is essential, where you get a good count at the bottom of the canyon. We have the radio tagging, so we have to know the tags going by. You have to have the environmental watch, so we can use the environmental conditions to predict what the expected loss rate in the river might be. And then we have we have to have good catch accounting, so we can keep the track of the tags as they're possibly being removed from the river system, and then you need this modeling framework to put all this information back together. And the model is obviously, as people say, is a representation, but if we can predict the return of fish, and particularly using the radio tags to test how these animals are moving up the river, then we can really start to build some confidence that we understand what the loss is of Fraser sockeye and how we can deliver them to particular populations. Your particular question about small stocks, tagging is a problem for small stocks because the likelihood of grabbing one of the very small populations at random in a very large population is very, very low. In most cases, you probably will not put a radio tag on a very, very small population. And so the model then allows you to also, you have to then assign, we talked about indicators yesterday, so you have to assign the very small stocks in some ratio to a bigger population that will likely have tags and can be monitored. And then you would have to infer what you observe in the large stock and that it's the same for the smaller. It's definitely more risky because you don't have a direct monitoring for it. But that's one of the fundamental reasons by describing this model as a risk assessment model. because then you could build these uncertainties into the modeling framework and that. And now, because we're talking about risk and it has human costs, because they have to determine, how risk averse or risk prone do you want to be in delivery, we would establish this model and then take it out to the community groups to discuss how you would apply it in season and what are these risk levels that you want to achieve.
Many of my clients who participate on the listening in on the Fraser panel calls, they hear test fishery reports from the Marine, and then they hear the numbers past mission, and then they hear the quaylark, and hopefully over time they're going to hear quaylark more and more. But question they often, or an observation they often have, is that the information out north of or upriver from quaylark gets pretty anecdotal or qualitative in nature. Would you agree that it might be useful or helpful to develop a series of networks of sampling platforms in the Fraser River that would provide more direct information that could be used in season?
I think there's conceptual value added to that approach, but it really needs to be structured in terms of what management objectives are. Right now, the management system is building the capacity to accommodate achieving escapement objectives plus net upstream fishery objectives through the escapement management at the mission site with the various enhancements that we're talking about. The biggest question that comes to mind from my perspective when we talk about in-season infrastructure above the canyon, for example, is how would it really come into play in terms of meaningful engagement of management decision making. And the reason I raise this is because it largely reflects the fact that decisions are made based on mission quaylark escapement. Management decisions are made based on escapement patterns and allowances, allocations for various fisheries objectives above those points, including accommodating things like loss rates. And a lot of the fisheries that are operating above there are already having impacts such that the value added in adding additional assessment capacity above those points becomes questionable in terms of providing useful in-season management perspective.
Would it not also help you in assessing health of the fishery, health of the salmon?
Sampling platforms definitely have value. I think there's something that's being overlooked, though, and that is that are extensive fisheries operating throughout most of the Fraser above quaylark, and these represent readily accessible opportunities in terms of both run timing estimation, not run timing, run size, indications of run strength, and as well as very constant feedback through monitoring programs of fish health. So there are pieces in place now that support these fairly effectively.
Dr. Riddell? Well, I agree with essentially everything, excuse me, that Timber has added. There's no question that you can get, collect samples and assess fish health is useful. Many times there's a significant lag in looking at fish health and how you associate that back to in-season decisions that are made fairly quickly. For a number of years, we've talked about, this integrated stock assessment platform throughout the Fraser Basin. I still think that that's a good way to be thinking about this. But what we have learned in working in the lower river in applying the tags that we then follow, and I think we talked about this during hydroacoustics, there's very clearly a cutoff of when we should handle fish in fresh water and apply these tags. That if we can tag fish at about 18 degrees Celsius and lower, then we have very good survival. If we just were tagging at about 18.5, then we were losing substantially more fish. And the impact of that is that you then have a compounding or a confounding of what's the fate of that tag. Was it removed in some fishery, or did it die naturally in the river? And you can't really attribute the cause of the loss of that radio tag. So I think the real value in the system now is putting the radio tags on where you can get large numbers with good survival, and then use the in-river programs as the recovery platforms, where you still get your mark recapture. You get the marked fish to unmarked ratios, and then you can sample for fish health. But tagging in river is looking like it's less and less likely because of the confounding factors.
Quite interested in the introduction of fish wheels and the use of fish wheels as a supplement to stock assessment. And as you know, there was and has been a fish wheel operating at Siska for a number of years. I wonder if you could comment on the usefulness of fish wheels and either at Siska or others as a stock assessment platform.
We've had opportunity to evaluate in a number of instances and locations throughout the river the utility of fish wheels in terms of their ability to support sampling activities. One of the things that's becoming quite clear, and it was quite clear early on, that fish wheels within the Fraser have a more limited utility than they do in other systems where there is substantially higher turbidity. One of the issues is that we're consistently seeing issues and concerns with respect to representativeness in terms of the sampling that we can achieve. This includes evaluations in the main stem of the river down in the Mission area. There has been more success associated with consistent and catch abundance in the Fraser Canyon area associated with the Siska fish wheel operation as a potential representative sampling tool. However, when we get above there, the catch data again seems to be quite spotty and suggests that the sockeye are able to fairly well avoid the gear, and thus there's bias associated with the sampling that occurs within it. Extensive evaluations in the Thompson have shown that there's essentially low value in proceeding with evaluations of fish wheels there. Fairly equivocal results coming out of the middle upper Fraser in terms of its ability to catch fish in sufficient numbers to represent much in the way of a meaningful platform for sampling. So they held promise. I think from the overall contribution that they are able to make in an ongoing way, our expectations have been substantially tempered recently given performance.
Dr. Riddell?
Well, I think Timber's comment about the incremental value of wherever you place any tool in the river is the key point again. And I say now we have the concern about if the temperature is above about 18.5, then we don't want to be applying more tags and stressing the animal because we know that we're going to lose a significant portion. I mean, frequently we were losing 50% of them, and so it is a significant problem. And that, but if the fish wheel was to work in a canyon area with very opaque water, they can be a wonderful sampling platform in the sense that they catch fish at a very regular rate, and so you can get them in good quality and so on. And that, so I mean, as a fishing tool, they might be appropriate, but I think it's really a matter of when you start talking about building the stock assessment framework throughout the basin, then we need to really think about where we put incremental programs that really provide some additional information for people conducting management in season.
Perhaps you've answered this generally, but I'd like to ask you specifically. The Northern Shuswap Tribal Council, as you know, has proposed fish wheels as a sampling platform for the measure of health and abundance coming through the NSTC member community territories, and they have not yet been able to manage to secure support from DFO for these efforts. Why is that, and is that linked to the answer you've raised earlier, if you concluded it's not of much value?
It's not so much that it's not of value. It comes down to the benefit associated with implementing that program. It's like, where would that information fit into? How would you use in-season run estimation abundance at a point in the area where this program is operated when most of the fisheries decision making has occurred well downstream of that point? There are not much in the way of regulatory options to affect management change with a monitoring site that far above major fisheries.
I'd like to pick up on that comment in a slightly different way, and it raises concerns that I observed when I reviewed Exhibit 381, which is your 2004 and 2005 salmon stock assessment plan, I didn't find in any of this document any objectives around ensuring the priority of FSC fisheries as part of your stock assessment. And I'm wondering if you could review that. I see on page 1 at objective 4, you want to improve capacity and opportunities for First Nations in that assessment plan. And I can turn to the various pages to help you review it, but I was quite surprised, and I'd like you to give you an opportunity to comment on why it is that FSC priorities are not part of your priorities in stock assessment. And in particular, if you could go to page 2 of 57, which will be the next page, and if you go to sockeye, I see that the PST and the international obligations and the management of domestic fisheries are there, but there is no mention whatsoever of First Nations obligations or the priority of those. Would you agree with me on that?
I cannot agree with you. I'd have to go through this extensively.
Well, I'm going to. The pages on sockeye are that's the one page. The next one is right next to it, page 3 of 57. You look at number.
I think I'll take a slightly different approach to responding to you here.
Okay.
The key is assessment components within this document as a framework for providing information. The relative impact of harvest comes into play at a general level. Our stocks exploited in a high, moderate, or low manner, irrespective of what the source of harvest is. So if there are high expected harvest rates, the assessment elements respond to that by providing higher resolution. If there are low expected harvest rates, it's not important to an assessment framework who the harvesters are in order to shape that.
We started this morning, this earlier today, talking about the various management objectives and that you're trying to balance. And you just mentioned again that the fish wheels aren't that useful or necessary in your stock assessments because most of the fishing has already occurred, or the large fishing will have occurred. I'm assuming you're talking about the fisheries in the marine. If you're not?
That's an incorrect assumption.
Or in the lower Fraser?
Yes.
All right. So if you were, a management objective was to move commercial fisheries or some of the fisheries upriver, and if you were actually trying to ensure FSC priorities for the upriver First Nations, a management objective and a usefulness could be found in fish wheels. Is that correct? Or in other selective fisheries upriver that can harvest large amounts of fish, provide sampling, provide health abundance, do all of those things. Would you agree with me on that?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I make the same extension that you do. The infrastructure in terms of in-season run strength abundance and the tools in the lower river, with the management adjustments and the understanding of potential survival rates, and the excuse me, and the management objectives of meeting a allocation, for use of a different word, for FSC requirements. So FSC becomes a part of escapement objectives at mission. These account for the need to move fish upstream, and if the objective is to move more fish upstream, mission will simply provide the ability to document that we've done that with the other tools in place, the environmental watch program, the tagging programs, models to adjust for management adjustments. The necessary pieces are in place to support additional fish because we have resolution to stock or CU levels based on estimates at mission. So I would describe it as a nice to do but not a need to do if we were going to organize things that way.
I'm glad that Timber brought up the point about incorporating it in the escape and objective past mission. So there is always an allowance made for the interior fisheries, and that it's built into by the run timing groups what is the management escapement goal to pass mission. right? And so in that context, we do take that into account. In this document, where I would agree that Timber made the comment that a dead fish is a dead fish, basically, and that we always discuss, and I think I mentioned this yesterday in terms of prioritizing programs, the importance of a program to delivery of a First Nation agreement or a food fishery location. But we really do consider that to be one of the domestic fisheries, right? In the sense that we don't differentiate that. If the delivery requirement changes substantially through time, then I expect that there is a point where we would have to make, very similar to previous discussions about the wild salmon policy, we may well have to adjust how the department estimates in season and where the fish actually are to conduct in-river fisheries.
I'll move on from this exhibit, and one more question about FSC, and I know you've picked up on this in a couple of different ways, but my clients, for example, those in Haida Gwaii and those in the Vancouver Island, are also concerned with the ever-increasing Fraser-centric nature of DFO's stock assessments. Would you agree that the increasing Fraser-centric nature of these informations and these programs are being balanced against providing information, the necessary information, or having the necessary program dollars to attend to salmon that are returning to spawn in either Haida Gwaii or in some of the Vancouver Island streams? That creates extra pressure.
Well, I think we've addressed that several times. Yes, there's no question that as the budgets are reduced through time and the priority placed on Fraser sockeye will put additional pressure on, well, it even include Fraser non-sockeye stocks and non-Fraser stocks. Now, in terms of impact on specific fisheries, you really have to look at that on a specific basis.
Mr. Commissioner's heard a little bit, and we'll hear more about the importance from a First Nations perspective in using traditional ecological knowledge as part of the balance to the scientific information. I haven't yet seen in the assessment plans or anything else, how is traditional ecological knowledge presently used, or how could we improve on that when determining what needs to be assessed and where?
That is a difficult question to respond to. I don't have a good answer for you. We've struggled with defining what and how traditional ecological knowledge might be obtained to feed into systems. I think it is clearly an area that we have identified as needing additional work, recognition that there is value to considering traditional ecological knowledge, but from my perspective, it's something that we clearly need to do additional work on in order to make anything meaningful in terms of progress.
Dr. Riddell?
Well, unfortunately, I have to agree. I mean, we've talked about it extensively through my time with the department, and it's always one that we've struggled to determine exactly how we would build in. In my, what I would say is limited understanding or experience with traditional knowledge, I find it informative on an ecosystem basis. Now, it's quite possible that people within the Fraser would have good insights into what we're calling the Environmental Watch Program, and that so they may have something to contribute in what's the severity of the conditions or where you're losing fish along the Fraser. That sort of information would be very useful to incorporate in the discussion like we had in the in-river management modeling, and that to use it to sort of verify whether it meets people's expectations. But we've talked about this at great lengths through the years, and we've never really made a great deal of progress in how to incorporate it, to be honest.
I've probably heard this, and I apologize to ask you to repeat it, but the Environmental Watch Program, I take it, is exclusively operated by the DFO.
Yes, it is, yeah.
And in the context of Ms. Gartner's question, is that what you were addressing in terms of incorporating TEK, or are you talking about something else?
Well, I think the question was more general than that, but I wouldn't limit the incorporation of TEK into the Environmental Watch. Environmental Watch is very much a physical measurement of flow and temperatures and a modeling program. It's actually starts with an array through the Fraser that you've heard from David Patterson. The modeling involves a 10-day forecast of environmental conditions in the river, and that's conducted at the Institute of Ocean Sciences and then fed back to the Fraser panel at the Pacific Salmon Commission.
Okay, turning to another area, which is collaborative work with First Nations in the implementation of your stock assessment plans. Again, I can refer you to Exhibit 381. I think you got it yesterday. There's one of your objectives is to work more closely to identify opportunities with First Nations. Mr. Whitehouse, you spoke yesterday about the complexities with sockeye spawning enumeration and capacity issues around First Nations. And if I heard your evidence correctly, you also spoke that it was, in your opinion, it was difficult to carve off any pieces of sockeye enumeration, spawning enumeration assessments for First Nations. Could you speak a little bit more about that? I understand there are various parts of sockeye enumeration. There's the visual surveys, there's the operating of fences, and it's also my understanding that there is some capacity already in place in some of these areas to do some of those parts. So I'd like you to help me understand why it is that some of that couldn't be carved out and better working relationships developed with people like the Northern Shuswap Tribal Council with respect to sockeye enumeration.
I think first it's important to acknowledge that there are a large number of collaborative efforts going on with First Nations throughout the watershed, that there has been directed activity on DFO's part to support the development of capacity within First Nations groups through the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy. And this has been a major partner in terms of sockeye assessment. I'll extend that to salmon assessment within the Fraser since '92. We have to recognize that throughout the watershed there are substantially different capacities amongst groups to participate. Some groups have made substantial progress in that period and have biological staff in-house that can provide the necessary oversight in terms of program delivery. I would stress that stock assessment is easy to characterize as counting fish, but it is a discipline, a science discipline. And it's important that there is the ability within organizations who are undertaking this work to support a science-based organization. There have been significant progress made. In some groups have in-house biologists, have technical staff that work on stock assessment activities and are participating quite fully in a number of different stock assessment activities, including sockeye assessment. For others, there are significant challenges in reaching these objectives, in getting technical and biological staff on strength. The challenges come from a number of different sources. Some of them relate to simply having opportunity to do enough of this work to actually be able to retain staff year after year. In a number of cases, we're talking about fairly limited opportunities in terms of duration of work annually, 6 to 8 weeks if we're simply dealing with the field work. And really what's important if we're going to make progress is to get an extension of the work that First Nations are involved with to the analytical, the data side. This is where they're going to develop the capacity to make linkages, and I speak about complexity, to make linkages on aspects of fish behavior and the implications of study design to changes in fish behavior, to changes in study design as they impact the quality of estimates delivered. These are all very important things from a science perspective to be able to maintain rigor on in terms of delivery. I know that there are a number of instances where First Nations would like to have much greater participation. They're running up against capacity issues and being able to find and retain people who have the technical background to participate. So I think we really need to work at a number of different levels in order to be able to help develop those. There's been instability with respect to the organizations that have resulted in strength waxing and waning over the period 92 to 2,000. And where we do see groups having a real ability to participate is where they've developed this in-house biology and technical capacity. So I think that's an important component.
Dr. Riddell, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I don't know that I can really. I think Timber has much more specific and direct understanding of the conditions. I shouldn't really comment.
Hearing will now adjourn until 2 p.m.